Hello and welcome to the first review of Request Month 2025. This is Duke Nukem Manhattan Project for PC and later ported to Xbox 360 and iOS. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is of course the PC version. This is an action platformer developed by Sunstorm Interactive and published by Rush Entertainment in 2002 for PC, and it was later ported to Xbox 360 in 2010 and iOS in 2014. And while the game was generally pretty well received on PC when it first released, the same can't be said of the Xbox 360 and iOS versions, both of which were received very poorly when they came out. Now, since I have absolutely no experience with the iOS and Xbox 360 ports, I can't really confirm or deny whether those are actually any good or not, but I can say that if you're concerned about trying to get this game running on PC, there's not really much you have to do with it. Now, I can't really speak for a physical copy of the game because I don't have that. My copy of the game is a digital one from back when GOG was still able to sell it, and while you unfortunately can't get that anymore as I'm making this video in early February of 2025, there is still a digital version available from the Zoom platform. They apparently managed to score some deal that allows them to distribute Duke Nukem 3D Atomic Edition, as well as Duke Nukem Manhattan Project and Duke Nukem 1 and 2, seemingly in perpetuity, so that is the only place you can get this digitally on PC anymore, at least, again, as I'm making this video, and that version of the game seems to work perfectly fine on modern systems, although it does require a bit of tweaking to be a bit more comfortable at widescreen displays, and it also requires you to force the game to have a frame rate cap of 60 FPS, because like a lot of games from that era, it simply doesn't function properly if it is running above 60 frames per second. In this particular case, you lose the ability to double jump, which is mandatory to be able to play the entire game, so you have to lock the frame rate at 60 in order to be able to actually play the game. Other than that, and the slight tweaking you have to do to get the camera perspective to be a bit more comfortable, it's a pretty straightforward experience of getting the game up and running. But the real question is whether or not this process is actually worth it. Is this a game that is worth picking up and playing through, especially if you're a Duke Nukem fan, but even if you're just a video game fan in general or a platformer fan? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into this and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on an engine called Prism 3D, and as the name implies, it is a full 3D engine, but the action is generally limited to being in a 2D plane, so you're only moving on horizontal and vertical axes for the entirety of the game as far as the general mechanics go. But every so often, as you're transitioning from one scene to another, or moving around the environment, it will shift the perspective so that it is more actual 3D, which does sometimes throw off your aim a bit, so that is something to keep in mind there. It can be a bit janky in that regard. It is also a bit janky running on modern systems. You can very easily see things like large sections of the environment just not having anything to render there. You can see the seams in the skyboxes. Of course, the skyboxes themselves are all just 2D backgrounds that are completely static. And every now and then you'll notice something that wasn't visible if you were playing this on a 4x3 display back in the day, but is noticeable if you're playing it in widescreen or ultra widescreen. For example, in this clip that I'm showing you right now of the first boss fight in the game, once you finish the second phase, the helicopter starts taking off to go on to the third stage of the fight, and one of the enemies falls out of the helicopter and explodes when it falls into the sky for no discernible reason, which is something you wouldn't have seen if you were playing in a 4x3 resolution with the default FOV, which is of course the camera perspective in this. But if you're playing it on widescreen and using an FOV that's comfortable for widescreen, like 90 degrees, you will notice it. Of course, that sort of thing's not really a big deal, but it's clearly not the way the game was originally intended to be shown, so I wanted to go ahead and mention that before anybody goes in the comments and is like, wow, this looks really janky. It is a bit janky, but a lot of the visual problems that you'll see are actually due to me running this in widescreen with a field of view of 90, as opposed to if you were playing it normally back in the day on a 4x3 display. Now, all that said, what about the visuals themselves? Well, it's a game from 2002, and it was built as more of a budget title to begin with, so it's definitely not much of a looker. Even for the time, the modeling is not great, the texture quality is fairly low but serviceable for 2002, and the animations are rather simplistic for the most part. There are a few nice visual touches here and there where the developers were kind of working within the constraints of the engine and the perspective of gameplay, and you have things like the camera perspective shifting around to give you some interesting angles and make the 3D environments really feel more 3D as opposed to just feeling like a 2D platformer. But in general, the visual quality itself obviously hasn't really aged all that well. The same is not necessarily true of the sound design, although the game's limited budget does show through in several ways. The first of these is that a few of the weapons, namely the assault rifle as they call it, is really more of a heavy machine gun, and the shotgun have very generic stock sound library sound effects to them. They don't sound bad necessarily, but they sound quite generic. And while the explosive weapons have a decent amount of oomph to them, they don't really have that kind of bass kick that you really want from a proper explosion sound effect that really makes you feel awesome. They do, however, compensate for that somewhat by having every explosion in the game shake the screen, so it's a bit of a give and take there. The rest of the sound effects generally work pretty decently, there's nothing that's really standout there, but then of course there's the voice acting, which is almost exclusively John St. John doing his thing as Duke Nukem, and funnily enough, also voicing the main antagonist in this game, Morphix. So in a weird roundabout way, Duke Nukem is basically trying to kick his own ass. This, of course, enhances the general goofiness of the game, but as far as the Duke lines themselves go, they're pretty good for the most part. He has some rather solid one-liners in this, although cleanup on aisle 4 is way overused and does tend to grate on your nerves after a while. And since the audio quality itself is still fairly high, these are not only some of the better lines that the character of Duke Nukem has ever uttered, but they also are some of the best sounding lines. Weirdly enough, he sounds better in this than he did in the likes of Duke Nukem Forever. Granted, a lot of Duke Nukem Forever's problem was the script, but that's beside the point. Point here is that the Duke lines in this game are generally pretty solid and still hold up fairly well. The rest of the voice acting considerably less so. Obviously, there are babes scattered around that will constantly say things like, "Save me, Duke," and there's obviously nothing really going on there. But there are occasionally some other voices in the game as well, and some of them are rather poorly mixed, like the mayor's speech in the opening cutscene of the game, where you can barely even hear what he's saying most of the time. And the rest of the lines you hear from all the other characters, including Morphix, just aren't really all that interesting. It's mainly Duke that's interesting in the voice department, which is more or less what you expect anyway from a Duke Nukem game. Then, of course, there's the soundtrack. Now, most of the soundtrack is very repetitive and pretty generic, but there is one standout track, and that is Grab Bag, the main theme of Duke Nukem. It's the kind of tune that is guaranteed to put you in a hell yeah, let's save the world kind of mood, and the version of it in this game, despite this being a rather low-budget release that was just a side game in the franchise, is the best version of Grab Bag that has ever been put into a Duke Nukem game. It just kicks all kinds of ass, and it makes me a bit sad that it was put into this game that very few people are really familiar with unless they're just diehard Duke fans, because it means the vast majority of people out there aren't really going to know about it and aren't going to know to seek it out, and instead are only going to know the original MIDI version that was in Duke 3D, or the version that was in Duke Nukem Forever, which is admittedly the best part of that entire game, or of course the Megadeth cover, which honestly I've never really been much of a fan of. And I know to some degree that's just kind of the curse of the spin-off game, but it is really a bit of a shame, isn't it? At any rate, presentation-wise, this is not going to be something you're really going to be all that impressed by, other than just a few nice visual touches here and there, as well as, of course, the voice of Duke Nukem and that wonderful rendition of Grab Bag. But while the presentation may not wow you, what really matter are the story, or in this particular case, more lack thereof, and the gameplay. This being an action platformer, and more specifically a Duke Nukem game, the story doesn't really matter all that much. Thanks to the machinations of the evil Morphix and his substance called glop, which is a sort of radioactive mutagenic ooze that will turn things like cockroaches and rats into monstrous mutants, and can apparently even mutate people into dangerous creatures as well, the Big Apple currently has a serious mutant infestation. Thankfully, they've got all the pest control they need in the form of action hero extraordinaire Duke Nukem, who is here to save babes and kick mutant and Morphix ass, and that is exactly what he is going to do throughout the entire game. Really, that's all you need to know about the story, because that's basically all the story you're actually going to get in this game. There's not much to it, and it's really only there to give you a very minimal justification for going from level to level. So what exactly are you going to be caring about? Well, obviously it's going to be the gameplay itself, which is split across 24 levels in total, each of which is split into 8 sections. So you have 3 levels per section, then you move on to the next section, and once you've gotten to the end of the 3rd level in any particular section, you're going to have a boss fight. Now, some of these are actual multi-stage boss fights that are, well, proper boss fights, and some of them are just slightly more powerful enemies than the basic ones that you were fighting, and they just have a lot of health. And while none of the boss fights in this game are particularly difficult, those ones that are just slightly more powerful basic enemy types are downright laughably easy to beat, meaning they just end up being more of a mild annoyance than anything else. Meanwhile, the proper boss fights, even if they're not necessarily difficult, are at least much more interesting than those other boss fights. So you at least have those to look forward to, but unfortunately they're pretty few and far between throughout the entire game. But of course, those are boss fights. Those are specific one-off fights. What about the vast majority of the game? What are you going to be doing throughout that? Well, it's a 2.5D action platformer, meaning that most of what you're going to be doing is running around and jumping around in a 2D plane, so you're going to be doing horizontal and vertical. You can jump, you can double jump, you can climb up ledges, you can climb up ladders and chains, and when you find certain ropes and pipes and such like that, you can jump up, grab onto them, and then just climb across them, although it's quite slow, of course. You'll be utilizing all of these movement techniques throughout the entire game to navigate the environments and avoid traps, and along the way you'll be constantly assailed by the mutant and robotic minions of Morphix. You have a variety of weapons at your disposal to deal with these various enemies, from things like your humble pistol and shotgun, all the way up to the gloop ray, which will actually demutate enemies. So say if you're going up against a mutant cockroach, it will demutate that enemy back into a regular cockroach, and then it can be stomped on to finish it off. Unlike in, say, Duke Nukem 3D, where each individual weapon has its own ammunition, all the weapons in Manhattan Project draw from one of 3 ammo pools: bullets, explosives, or gloop, with of course the sci-fi weapons going into the gloop pool. Most of the weapons are quite effective, although the gloop ray, the one that demutates enemies, is really not all that useful. You're much better served just saving your gloop ammunition for the pulse cannon that you'll get, which is basically the energy rifle of the game. You can charge up shots, or you can just rapid fire by continually tapping the fire button, and that'll deal with enemies much more effectively than trying to demutate them. In total, there are 8 weapons, although the 8th one is actually a secret weapon that you get for finishing the game on hard mode and finding all of the nukes throughout all of the levels, which is something that I'll talk about more in a moment. So in practical terms, throughout the entire game, there's only 7 weapons plus the Mighty Boot. In addition to the weapons themselves, there's also a couple of power-ups that you can get, and these will give you a force field that absorbs all incoming damage for a brief period of time, as well as a damage boost power-up that will double the amount of damage you do, and weirdly enough, a jetpack power-up that will allow you to awkwardly try to fly around the level, and you can cancel it by pressing the jump key, and you'll be using that mainly to find different secret areas and occasionally to do some standard platforming as well. And interestingly enough, if you get close enough to an enemy to where the burners of the jetpack are right on them, it will actually do damage to that enemy as well, so you can technically use it as a weapon. And you'll be utilizing all of these methods of eviscerating your foes to carve your way through a sea of mutants, from mutant cockroaches to mutant rats, mutant pigs, so on and so forth, to robots that Morphix has put together to fight you, whether it be floating drones or stompy big robots that try to shoot at you with more powerful weaponry, or even robot dominatrixes, because, I mean, it's a Duke Nukem game, what do you expect? And for the most part, you'll find that the experience of trying to play through Duke Nukem Manhattan Project is pretty straightforward. You just run around, you jump around, you climb on stuff, you blast the living crap out of any enemies that get in your way, and you ultimately just try to complete 2 objectives on every single level: save a babe and find the key card that will allow you to get to the next level. Once you've saved the babe and found the key card, you can move on to the next level, and the process repeats. That's all pretty standard platformer type stuff, although of course with a Duke Nukem twist, but there are a couple of interesting things about the way the mechanics actually work out in this game. The first is the ego system. Now, ego is your health in this game, and it's something that they would continue on in the series as well. And you replenish it not just from finding health pickups scattered around the levels, but you can also replenish your health whenever you kill an enemy, and the manner in which you kill the enemy is taken into account. So for example, you'll get less ego back if you shoot an enemy or blast them with, say, a rocket launcher or whatever, than if you kick them to death. So interestingly enough, you have an incentive to kick enemies, but you have to be careful about how you do that, because there are 3 ways that you can kick an enemy. First, you can jump kick them, which is the ideal method. It has the most mobility, it allows you to avoid enemy attacks, and it also does quite a bit of damage. There's the standard kick, where you just stand in place and kick. Those are a bit trickier to land, and they tend to leave you wide open for attack. And then there's the slide kick, which does less damage than the other 2, but chances are you're going to be doing it a lot anyway, because not only does it allow you to slide under things sometimes in the levels to get to places you could normally get otherwise, but it's also the kick that occurs whenever you just happen to be moving left or right, so you'll just end up doing it a lot anyway. Regardless of how you're trying to kick the enemy, however, you're gonna find that it's a pretty janky process. The controls don't always want to cooperate with you, so you might try to do jump kicks, for example, and it just ends up kind of flailing around awkwardly. Or the enemy might be standing right on a ledge, so instead of just jumping up and kicking like you're trying to do, you'll end up grabbing onto the ledge instead. And then you try to jump again to kick them, and it doesn't want to work. It just ends up being fairly clumsy and awkward, and makes what should be a fairly straightforward experience of just jumping around and kicking the living crap out of enemies considerably more frustrating than it should be. Now thankfully, if you don't want to deal with the awkwardness of trying to kick enemies, you can just blast them with the variety of weapons, and the game does give you plenty of ammunition throughout, so it's never really a major problem, but it is still an annoyance. Similarly annoying is the platforming itself. Now, for the most part, the platforming works mostly fine. The problem is when it doesn't work mostly fine. There's one particular instance that comes to mind immediately where you have to jump over a couple of spike traps. Now, the first one you have to jump over is pretty easy to jump over, but because of the way the hitbox is on the second spike trap, more often than not, you're actually just gonna jump into it even when you think you're going to clear it. So it ends up just being this immensely frustrating mess of trial and error trying to jump over that damn thing. And because the game only operates on auto-saves, you can't just save right before you jump and just keep trying it over and over again until eventually you manage to make it over. Instead, every time you have to go from where you entered that area all the way down to the switch puzzle that you have to go through in order to create a platform to be able to jump between these spike traps anyway, and then you have to go back up and try to jump over these spike traps again. And to give you an idea of just how frustrating this can be, I'm gonna go ahead and make a how to fail video showing you just how many times I had to try to jump over that damn thing before I finally managed to make it over. There's also a certain section of the game where they decided to implement ice physics, and thankfully it's only in one very specific area of one level, because the ice physics in this game are just a mess. It constantly interferes with your ability to jump. Half the time you'll be sitting there trying to jump and it just will not actually jump. It ends up being immensely frustrating for that one bit, but again, thankfully it's only for one bit of one level. All these annoyances and frustrations certainly add up, and while they're not enough to completely tank the entire experience, they do end up detracting quite significantly from the experience, and they also make the experience of trying to find all of the nukes immensely frustrating. Now, I mentioned this before, so what is that I'm talking about here? Now, every single level in this game has 10 nukes hidden somewhere. They're just a collectible that you can pick up. And some of them are just standing out in the open somewhere that you had to complete a platforming challenge to get to, whereas others are dropped by enemies. Regardless, once you find all 10 of these in any particular level, then it gives you a max ego boost, so you get increased maximum health, as well as increased maximum ammo for all of your ammo types. This means that the collectibles actually serve a gameplay function, and that gameplay function is something that you'll probably want to go for, considering that it makes Duke more powerful, and Duke Nukem is really all about the power fantasy. Plus, of course, if you want the secret weapon, then you have to get all of them, and if you want to encounter Wazma, which is a secret boss enemy that you can find, you also need to get all of them. So there are definitely incentives to finding all of these, but some of them are hidden in secret areas that can be really obnoxious to try to find a way to access. Some of them are stuck behind platforming challenges that just end up being frustrating more than anything else. And of course, some of them are hidden with certain enemies, so if you don't encounter those enemies or you try to avoid those enemies, then you're not going to get them. On top of all of that, the level design is kind of all over the place. Some of the levels are very straightforward, very simplistic, and not really all that interesting, whereas others are just clunkily designed and a bit annoying, and still others just have layouts that are actually quite confusing to navigate. The end result of all of this is that Duke Nukem Manhattan Project is a very mixed bag of a game. If you're used to more modern fare when it comes to platformers, you'll find that Manhattan Project feels pretty unrefined and clunky in a lot of ways. And while Duke Nukem fans will probably be able to power through the game's issues and just enjoy it because it's Duke Nukem, and frankly they do a very good job of nailing the general vibe of Duke Nukem, but even diehard Duke Nukem fans are still going to have to contend with the general jank of the game, as well as a few jokes that were very dated even when this thing originally came out, like Matrix references and Monica Lewinsky jokes. Not to mention one particular, I guess it's supposed to be a joke, but it was never funny to begin with, and these days the terminology they use in it is considered a slur, so I can't actually show it to you. So yeah, definitely didn't age well in that regard. But if you're a Duke Nukem fan that can get past the jank and the aspects of the game that really didn't age well, then you'll likely find the experience of playing through Manhattan Project to be a pretty bittersweet one, because it was the last time that Duke Nukem as a character was still cool, when he was still a cartoonish amalgamation of 80s action movie heroes doing 80s action movie hero things, before Duke Nukem Forever changed his characterization to just being an asshole. And when you stop and think about that, as of making this video here, it has been 23 years since the end of an era, the end of Duke Nukem actually being cool. And that's just sad. Especially considering that when you assess this game as a whole, it ends up being a 2.5 out of 5 for precisely the reasons that I just outlined. While a Duke Nukem fan will certainly want to play it, the average platformer fan will just find it to be a very weak game, and the average gamer in general will not really be able to get past the jank, and also likely won't be able to get past the dated jokes and aspects of the game that have aged particularly poorly. But if nothing else, at least it gave us a truly kick-ass version of Grab Bag, so there is that. Thank you all very much for watching, and welcome to Requests Month proper. And as a reminder, make sure to submit any of your questions for the upcoming Q&A video before month's end. I hope you enjoy the other reviews I have lined up for this month. Some of them are things that have been requested for quite a while, so stay tuned for all of those. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really helps out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.